Good afternoon and welcome. We are well into 2 years of the pandemic, and we are still having daily consequences as we struggle with it. And today, we will continue to have our problems because of the pandemic. But I am Tony Sapienza. I'm a pleasure to welcome you here. I chair the Board of Trustees of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and this will be our annual meeting. Unfortunately, Amanda McMullen, our president, and our keynote speaker, Daniel Weiss, either have COVID symptoms or have been in proximity to somebody with COVID symptoms, and they will not be able to join us in person today. However, they will join us virtually, and we will have the program as we had originally anticipated, although some of it will be on video. I would like to thank Amanda and Daniel for staying home in order to protect all of us and this museum community, because we didn't need to create a super spreader type event. It wouldn't have done as well in the press. So, but thank you for coming, and I want to thank them for continuing to be a part of our presentation today.
So good afternoon. Thank you, Tony. I do wish that I could be with you all in person, but as Tony mentioned, my son has tested positive. I can let you know that he's doing really well, but out of tons of caution for all of you and our team, I am home. And it's certainly quite a sign of the times, isn't it? I will say it's also a sign of our strength that we can connect virtually. And because of that, I'm delighted to welcome you to our 119th annual members meeting. You know, it's an incredible moment here for the Whaling Museum. We are emerging from these challenging years with new strength, new property, and new dreams. And this is all because of you. Thank you. 2021 marked a 202% increase in visitation. Let me say that again. 202% increase in the number of visitors coming to the museum. That was driven by our popular celebration of the New Bedford-born artist, Albert Pinkham Ryder. Our impact was further magnified by our learning partnerships, from our virtual teaching programs that had us beaming into classrooms to our vibrant public programs. We reached thousands upon thousands last year, and we continue to hold the community together. Today, we will not only celebrate 2021, but we are sprinting forward and fast. Thanks to both of our guests, Matthew Fisher and Daniel Weiss, you will all be treated to a glimpse of the future. And there's no doubt you will pick up on some themes. You will hear about how museums are the fabric of any community. And founded as the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, I like to think about the Whaling Museum's purpose in stitching together our powerful narratives and reflecting our stories through art, history, science, and culture. You will also get great insight into this digital moment that we're all in. Innovators like the Whaling Museum embraced our digital power these last 2 years to not only remain relevant, but to better serve our students and keep our community connected. So how do we keep our foot on the pedal? We do it by having a talented team, a dedicated board, outstanding volunteers, and an extraordinarily generous group of members and supporters. Literally, you make this possible. In just a moment, we'll get to hear from Matthew Fisher. He's the head of a digital interactives firm called Night Kitchen. Matthew and his team are helping us create a dynamic digital element for the museum. And the museum is only able to do this and so much more on the digital frontier, thanks to longtime supporters, Nancy and Jack Breitmeyer. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of sitting with Nancy and Jack in their living room, and we got to dreaming big. And then we got to dreaming really big. And as thoughtful supporters of the museum, Nancy and Jack wanted to help us reach a new generation of curious minds. They shared with me the stories of Jack's deep connection to the museum, his time as a kid running through the Bourne building, learning and playing and discovering on the Lagoda. These moments formed his love of New Bedford, his pride in our community, and his passion for understanding who we are and where we come from. Together, Nancy and Jack wanted to build a gift that would help the museum reach forward and grab hold of the next generation of Jacks and Nancy's. And thanks to their incredible vision, today I am overwhelmed to announce their gift of $1 million to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Please give them a round of applause. So outstanding, so outstanding. Thanks to Nancy and Jack, we are celebrating our digital engagement efforts, and we are able to find a great partner in this new frontier with the creative team from Night Kitchen. And now I am so delighted to welcome our featured speaker, Matthew Fisher from Night Kitchen Interactives, who will give us all a glimpse of the future of museum engagement. Thank you.
First off, as I mentioned, I'd really like to thank the New Bedford Whaling Museum for inviting me to speak today and for inviting our company to collaborate on this dynamic new in-gallery digital experience. But perhaps more importantly, I would like to thank all of you, the membership. You are the ones who make all of this possible. The fact that you are here today tells me that you are curious people, that you love museums like I do, that you are all recognized that museums are places rooted in the past, but that play a vital role in shaping the future for future generations. I'd like everyone to take a moment, and it sounds like our Jack, we were just talking about earlier, has done just this, to take a moment to consider the museum experiences over the years and how they have shaped you and how they shape the way you engage in the world. You might recall an aha moment, a transformative moment, an exhibit or an artifact that led you to see things differently. For many of us, these came early in life. I certainly recall the first time that I saw the works of Marcel Duchamp at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and recognized that a work of art could be a puzzle to solve or a question to be answered. I'm certain that you, like me, have become more savvy museum goers throughout your years, but we still have these museum experiences that make us see things just a little differently or form new connections. These moments, they give us a rush. They give us a dopamine high that comes from every micro revelation. And they're one of the key reasons we visit and love museums. Yes, we come to enjoy the familiar objects and stories, but we also come to be challenged, to be surprised, and to be delighted. This is what we strive to do in designing museum experiences, to inspire meaningful connections. The museum and the visitors do that together. In Duchamp's words, you are the onlookers who make the picture. To do this, we need to align with what is an evolving sense of what a museum is today. ICOM, the International Council for Museums, just last week adopted a new museum definition, stating that the museum continues to do the critical work of acquiring and exhibiting, while also becoming more accessible and inclusive and operating with the participation of communities. Communities like the people here in this room. In short, a museum should both be a temple and a forum. In this month's issue of Museum Magazine, the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian advocates for this new definition of museums. We desperately need gathering places for discussion, discourse, debate, even controversy. Forums and safe places for some unsafe ideas concerning cultural history and human experience, past and present. For a museum founded in 1989, devoted to the culture of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, this approach has always been central to their mission. But for others, fulfilling the broader museum definition is a greater challenge. Consider the National Portrait Gallery, for example, who have an uphill battle to expand their focus. The question is, how do you show the presence of absence? How do you actually signal that there is a whole lot of people and voices and opinions missing? And how do you actually bring it forward in a way that makes people get emotional about it, think about it, and get invested in it? This is a challenge that the New Bedford Whaling Museum has already been taking head on, which is one of the reasons I'm delighted to be working with this museum. From your mission and goals, you are already embracing this model and are doing some great work to fulfill the broader definition. With your programs and events, you are working to delight, surprise, and engage your visitors into the future. Putting these ideas into practice in the galleries can be a greater challenge. How do we engage multiple viewpoints and voices while remaining true to collecting and exhibiting the artifacts and experiences that are essential to the fabric of your museum? I have found that exploring the space between how museums have told their stories in the past and how they look to tell them in the future is where the public is most engaged. In navigating the razor's edge of what we consider relevant and meaningful, today we can create the most compelling visitor experiences for tomorrow. In finding safe ways to explore these unsafe or challenging topics is exactly the role that museums are best positioned to play in our society today. Why? Because beyond our friends and family, museums are our most trusted resource that we have as a society today. The fact that most people visit museums with their friends and family make the museum gallery an ideal place to explore the unknown. And speaking of safe places, oh, sorry, I'm lagging a little here on my slides. This was the study that I was just referring to. And speaking of a safe place to explore the unknown, this is a perfect transition to talk about the Lagoda Interactive Touch Table. The objective, to engage young families in the story of the Lagoda, and more broadly, a 19th century whaling journey around the world, contextualized within the Bourne Gallery, its exhibits and collections. Our approach, a multiplayer game in which up to 4 visitors experience a whaling voyage and its romantic adventure with all of its romantic adventure and deadly challenges. So, why a game in the galleries, you might ask? Somebody was asking me just a few minutes ago. First off, games are fun. They allow visitors naturally to enter a state of flow, which is conducive to progression and learning. Who doesn't want to go on a voyage around the world in a grand old sailing ship? Games are cooperative and competitive, engaging visitors in social and formal learning. In a game we designed for the Smithsonian called Cropetition, visitors compete to produce the most bountiful harvest, but they also learn to share seeds when times are hard. In our game, whaling crews must work together on the ship to survive a storm, but they could compete in their whaleboats to catch the whale. Games are visual, kinesthetic, and auditory and support a variety of learning styles. With the Edgar Allan Poe House Challenge on our Museum Host app, visitors explore the rooms, search for clues, and unlock AR and VR media experiences that bring the author's story to life in the house. Games are also a safe way to encounter danger. Before COVID, we created Illsville for the College of Physicians, a game in which players work to educate, vaccinate, and treat diseases in their town throughout history. A whaling voyage was a dangerous thing for the crew, the captain, and of course, for the whale. But we can explore these things as players in a game in ways that are comfortable and even fun. Games allow us to try and fail, to learn and to grow. With the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, we created Sail the Seas, where visitors attempted to build a ship seaworthy enough to make the Great Passage across the Atlantic. But if they fail, their ship could founder and sink. But they learn from their mistakes and rebuild to create a more seaworthy craft. Ultimately, games motivate us to succeed, to learn the skills and knowledge we need along the way to be a hero in our own story. In our whaling voyage, don't forget to sharpen your harpoons before someone shouts, "There she blows." Perhaps less obvious, but more significant, immersive storytelling with characters and an experiential narrative can drive deeply effective experiences. In playing the Lagoda game, visitors must get to know the crew, not as a portrait on the wall, but as a character in a story that they themselves control. Of course, there are the captains and the ship owners who are so essential to the story, not to mention to your community here in New Bedford. But what of the Maori harpooner who held whales sacred, or the young woman who disguised herself as a man to join the whaling voyage, or the naturalist who shipped out to come face to face with the great Leviathan so he could better render its likeness, or perhaps the writer who would pen the great American novel. The crew of our whaling voyage will give the players a sense of who they are, not just what they do. Gameplay creates unique memories. Every visitor experience will be different depending on their mode of play. As they build affinities with the crew, players are drawn into their world. They become motivated to succeed. Whether it's about sending the right crew members aloft when a sudden squall arises, or finding the best crew member to strike up a song during a lull, each player will have their own story unfold and the memories that come with it. We're still in the design thinking stages of this project, but we're already excited about the potential outcomes. What does success look like when this game debuts in the gallery next year? Well, of course, we want visitors to have fun on their whaling voyage. We want them to learn a thing or two about the people and the history of whaling. We really want them to explore the galleries after they play and seek out the artifacts and the events that they experienced in their voyage. Success to me would be your 8-year-old niece or granddaughter stops you in front of a painting depicting a stove boat and not only explains what's going on, but maybe has a few ideas of how they might have avoided the upset. So once again, I'd like to thank you for your time and your enthusiasm and your dedication to the museum, and I'd like to thank New Bedford for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you, Matthew. That was very, very interesting. And as Amanda noted in her comments, we have been actively engaging in digital initiatives, and we will continue to do so in the years to come. I'm honored to preside over our members' business portion of our annual meeting. To start, I would like to ask for a motion to open the official 119th annual members meeting of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. Do I have a motion? And a second? All those in favor? Motion carries. We shall open the meeting. I would also like to ask for a motion to accept the agenda as noted on your programs for those in person and shared online and through our invitation. Is there a motion to accept the agenda? And a second? All those in favor? Any opposed? There being none, the motion carries. Today's annual members meeting is being dedicated to 2 former museum trustees who passed away earlier this year. Truman Kasner and Artie Parker, in appreciation of their decades of service and commitment to the museum. Truman Kasner was an accomplished lawyer and business advisor who took great joy in many endeavors, especially sailing and storytelling. He was also a decades-long member of the museum who served several terms as a trustee and brought many friends into the museum community. Arthur Parker was esteemed as an investment advisor to clients, many of whom became his friends. His love and dedication to family were unparalleled. Artie served multiple terms on the museum's board, as well as a number of other nonprofit organizations in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Both Truman and Artie were wonderful people, a pleasure to know, and they will continue to be deeply missed. We do have some business to get to and important votes. But first, let's take a look back at an overview of our year, which includes the presentation of our slate of officers, slate of new trustees, and slate of returning trustees.
The New Bedford Whaling Museum has emerged from 2021 a newer, stronger, and bolder museum. Inspired by our new mission statement to ignite learning through explorations of art, history, science, and culture, rooted in the stories of people, the region, and an international seaport, the museum welcomed nearly 60,000 through our doors and on our screens. We opened 6 new exhibits, offered 43 public programs, and reached thousands of students. Our strategic plan prioritized that all guests feel welcomed and deeply engaged, that the museum stewards our tremendous collection, and importantly, that the museum is a forever institution, thriving for centuries to come. Our year marked an investment in our community, with the museum providing free or reduced admissions to more than 20% of our visitors. And by providing over 800 memberships to New Bedford families and teachers, we accelerated our efforts to build a museum for all. And we continued to dream big as we planned for our expansion. In 2021, the museum acquired the property just across the street from our front entrance. And thanks to the incredible generosity of 20 supporters, we did this debt-free.
Good afternoon, everybody. 2021 was a particularly strong year for the museum, despite the second year of the pandemic. Our philanthropic goals were exceeded, our operating budgets met, and we successfully raised the money we needed to acquire 11 William Street. Not only that, but we ended the year with not only a surplus, but a great response to our annual fund and our endowment at an all-time high. Our annual financial audit was just completed, just in March recently, and a clean opinion was granted, so all the facts as presented were true. Now we're in 2022. We're off to a solid start. It's going to be a difficult year because we've added some costs since 2019, but our goal is to beat 2019, the last pre-pandemic year. Michelle, why don't you fill in some of the numbers that I've lacked?
Thanks, Wick. 2021 was an incredible year. Still deep in a pandemic and still facing significantly lower than normal visitation, the museum was lifted by our members and supporters. 2021 marked the 14th consecutive year that the museum achieved a positive operating result. Overall, there was a 20% increase in total revenue and support, and in turn, 20% growth in our program. We mounted exciting exhibitions, cared for and grew our collections, expanded our education programs to serve thousands of students in the museum and through virtual programs. We published new scholarships, served hundreds of scholars in our reading room, and thousands more with our digital assets. The museum continues to invest in its campus with the acquisition of 11 William Street, and we remain committed to the care and stewardship of our assets on Johnny Cake Hill. In 2021, with donor support, operating funds, and support from the New Bedford Community Preservation Fund, we continued the critical restoration work on the iconic Bourne and Wood buildings, preserving these treasures for generations to come. We ended the year with our endowment at $19.2 million, with the addition of new gifts and a 13% investment return. Our financial position remains strong with $36 million in net assets.
Well, for all of this, Michelle, we certainly owe a great debt of gratitude to our museum members and donors who stuck with us and showed unwavering support in a difficult time.
Indeed, we do. And they can be assured that their support makes an impact. We've demonstrated our commitment to fundraising efficiency and strong fiscal management, and earned the highest GuideStar Platinum seal and the top 4-star rating from Charity Navigator.
Yeah, and while there's little doubt that 2022 has its own challenges, we've emerged from the pandemic and have even greater resolve to continue on our path of growth and investment and to deepen our commitment and connection to our community. Congratulations to the museum team for a job well done, and a big thank you to all of you members.
The Governance Committee is charged with the work of nominating trustees, confirming, renewing trustees, and putting forth a slate of officers for the membership to vote on. It is also tasked with the evaluation of the quality of the board's operation as a board. Over the years, I have had the privilege of serving as the chair of the Governance Committee. In addition to our nominating and board oversight efforts, the committee has been tasked with further advancing the museum's commitment to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Members should have confidence in the board's oversight and in the museum's efforts to fulfill its strategic goals. The board chair, Tony Sapienza, will ask the members to vote on the Governance Committee's slates for officers, second-term trustees, and for new trustees.
The Whaling Museum is here to ignite your learning. You inspire us to be a museum dedicated to welcome, engage, steward, and thrive. Every step last year demonstrated the power of this museum to create moments of discovery rooted in art, history, science, and culture. Our work also demonstrates our commitment to you. As a member and as our neighbors, we are here for you and because of you. Thank you. Thank you for making 2021 an extraordinary year. We will now move into the voting part of this meeting. We will have proxies and we will vote by hand here in this auditorium. There will be no voting on the Zoom screen because it is a little difficult to do. But I want to thank Lloyd and the Governance Committee for their work and the nominations they have proposed. I want to thank Wick Simmons and the Finance Committee for the great work that they have done in the report that you just witnessed. We will first move to vote to approve the class of 2025, the new trustees that Lloyd presented in the governance report. Victoria Pope, Gil Perry, Ralph Martin, Lisa Whitney, and Susan Wolkoff. Is there a motion to nominate the slate? And a second. Are there any additional nominations from the floor? There being none, I will call the question. Is all those in favor of the slate of 5 new trustees, please signify by raising their hands. Are there any opposed? There being none, the motion carries and we have 5 new trustees. Congratulations to those new trustees. We have a second vote. We have nominations for a second term, and we will now vote to approve those second term trustees that Lloyd presented in his report. They are Davis Webb and Ed Howland. Is there a motion to approve these nominees? And a second? All those in favor? Are there any opposed? The motion carries. We are honored to have Ed and Davis continue with us for another 3-year term. For our final vote of proposed officers, I will now invite Trustee Tina Schmidt to preside over the vote.
Tony's not allowed to do this, so. We're now going to vote on the slate of officers as presented by Lloyd McDonald in his governance report. Are there any nominations from the floor? There being none, could I have a motion? Okay, and a second? All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion carries. Tony, I will turn it back to you. Congratulations.
Good job, Tina. Thank you for doing that. It is a parliamentary rule that the presiding officer cannot be cannot preside when he's being voted upon. So I did have to step down, but thank you, Tina. You filled in very, very nicely. Okay, moving right along. Let's see, where am I here? That concludes the governance process for this year. I want to ask if there is any new business to bring before the annual members meeting. There being none, are there any other motions from the floor to bring before the annual meeting? There being none, I will move right along to the next part of our presentation. And at this time, I would like to acknowledge how much the Whaling Museum has benefited from the wisdom of leaders in our community. We are deeply grateful for their dedication and leadership. We have 4 retiring trustees this year. Their pictures are on the screen. Joe McDonough, George Mock, John Pinheiro, and David Wiss. And they are, let's see, Joe is here, right up in the front row. Welcome. And I am looking for the others. They could not attend today, but that's quite all right. We have these presentations to make. And Joe, if you would step forward, I'd be happy to. For those of you who don't remember, not only was Joe treasurer, he was treasurer for 10 plus years. And when Wick referred to in the financial report how we balanced the budget, it was under Joe's leadership as the treasurer of the museum that we were able to accomplish that goal. So thank you very much, Joe, for your work. Okay. We're now going to switch gears to our keynote speaker, who, as I mentioned earlier, could not be with us today, but is with us virtually. Daniel Weiss is the Met's President and Chief Executive Officer. He's been at the helm of the Metropolitan Museum since 2015. A scholar of art history and a seasoned leader of complex institutions, Weiss was previously president of Haverford College and Lafayette College. He holds an MBA from Yale and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University in Western, Medieval, and Byzantine art. The author of 7 books and numerous articles, his most recent book is entitled Why the Museum Matters, will be out this fall. What does the Met have in common with the New Bedford Whaling Museum? Well, the answer is everything. Everything we face as an institution, he is facing in his leadership of his institution. The decision he struggles with, I assure you, Amanda faces them every day as well. The debates our board has, well, I bet they are very similar to the debates on his board. My point is this, our budgets might be different, theirs is larger than ours, but the work to create meaningful places to learn, discover, and relax are very, very similar. We are honored to have him here virtually to share his perspective on museums today and tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Weiss.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you, at least virtually. So I'm delighted to have a chance to speak with you today, and I'm very disappointed that I can't be with you in person. It was my intention to be there until I don't seem to have COVID, but I have something that looks like and acts like COVID, and I've been in my apartment, and I'm sitting here with you virtually. But I'm delighted to have a chance to talk a little bit about the museum movement in America and how it relates to your work at New Bedford. I have been enormously impressed in learning more about your museum to get a sense of your history, your dreams, the status and the progress that you have made, and the work that you're planning to do in the years ahead. All of it is extraordinarily exciting, and I'm delighted to have a small part in this. And I told Amanda that after all of this passes and I am better and she's no longer quarantined, I'm coming to visit. I really look forward to getting a chance to do that. The title for my remarks today could very well be The Museum and the Community, Past, Present, and Future. And really what I want to do is, and I'll do this briefly in my remarks today, to talk about the museum movement in America and what a great success it is and why that is. What is it about museums that make them so important in our society? And why are they so distinctive in America compared to the museums in the rest of the world? And indeed, I would argue they are. They're very distinctive. And for one of the central reasons for that is the ways in which the community creates them and sustains them. So I'd like to speak very briefly a little bit about the history of the idea of museums. And I promise I'll do this quickly. But if we think about the history of human civilization, going back as far as we can to the earliest moments of recorded history, let's say in the Mesopotamian region in the ancient Near East, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, there is evidence always from the onset of civilization that people collected works of art or objects and curated them in ways to give them meaning in a larger context. This is something we see in every civilization going back in history. There's something fundamental about the human experience in wanting to make sense of our own world by using objects and organizing them in ways that allow us to tell stories and derive meanings from them. Whether those meanings are factual or fictive, it actually doesn't even matter. But this idea around connecting ourselves to objects in this way goes back to the ancient world. We can think about people like the great king Nebuchadnezzar II, who was a Neo-Assyrian king. He's the guy who led the army that conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and probably stole the Ark of the Covenant. He's the guy who built the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He also was a guy who created a museum in his own palace where he collected the works of art from the societies he conquered, and he actually curated those collections in ways to tell stories about them. So this idea goes back a long way. We see it in the Greek world. If you've ever been to Athens and visited the Acropolis, the Parthenon is a religious sanctuary, to be sure, but it also functions as a cultural institution, as a museum, telling stories about the Athenian people. And the works of art that they created that adorned that building were understood to function like an art museum. And throughout antiquity and into the modern world, tourists and visitors who go to those places think of them in the same way as they might visit the Louvre or the Metropolitan Museum or the New Bedford Whaling Museum. There is continuity in that kind of historical association, which is really the larger point. That was established very well in the ancient world. And if we fast forward 1,500 years to the Enlightenment, to the 18th century, when there were new ideas about individual rights, the purposes of government, the separation of church and state, the idea that individuals have a right to their own destiny, to their own education, to their own advancement. These were ideas that were developed in the Enlightenment. It was in that moment that the museum moment was brought into the modern world. It was at that moment in the 18th century that the British Museum was created, which was intended to collect the objects of fascination from science, art, culture, and history from around the world, to bring them to London, to put them in this building so that the public, so that the citizens of the United Kingdom could come, in the world, could come and see these objects and learn from them. It was during this period that the Louvre was created, and hundreds of other museums throughout Europe were created. And it was following that great moment in the 19th century that the American experiment was created. And so our history as creating these kinds of institutions goes back as far back as one can go in looking at human civilization. But there was something very new and distinctive about the American experiment. And this really began in the second half of the 19th century. The Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts were both founded in 1870. And of course, the New Bedford Whaling Museum was founded just 33 years later in 1903. During that period of those decades, at the end of the 19th century, the American experiment in museum creation was flourishing. And every town and city of any size had the impulse and the desire to create these institutions. And in New Bedford, for example, the impulse came this was a moment of transition in your society. The whaling, the business of whaling had kind of exhausted itself by the middle and latter part of the 19th century. Textiles were on the rise. New Bedford was continuing to thrive as a community. And just like everywhere else in the United States, in this great fluorescence of interest in cultural and history, New Bedford created it was initially a historical society with the idea of creating an institution that allowed the community to save, collect, study, and interpret its own history. And then over the course of succeeding generations, that mission expanded and evolved in fundamental ways, so that today the New Bedford Museum focuses on art, history, science, and culture in ways that's really a derivation or an expansion of that original foundational museum. But if we think about the founding of the New Bedford Museum in 1903, there were core values associated with what that community cared about that were embedded in what the museum was intended to do. New Bedford was a place that valued individuality, individual rights, diversity. Indeed, the city was at that time a diverse place. They thought of themselves in fundamental ways as a global citizen, having an international harbor, engaging in commerce throughout the world. There were connections in all kinds of ways that extended beyond the boundaries of the local community. The cultural institutions, the museum, were intended in that way to draw those connections to the larger movement, just as the Metropolitan was. As Tony says, we may be different in scale or in core operations, but not really in the ways in which we serve our mission and meet our obligations to the public. So as we think about that, what is it that is distinctive then about the American Museum? I would argue that American museums are really, in a fundamental way, social experiments. They were created from a completely new context, unlike the museums that had been created in Europe that inspired them earlier. And in the most fundamental way, that's because these museums were created by the local communities. They were not created by a founding aristocracy. They weren't created by the king. We didn't have a king. They weren't even created by the government. They were created by the local community through participation collectively in the formation of a collection, the creation of a physical facility, and a funding model that was sustainable, that didn't depend on the government or one or two donors, but actually it depended on something far more diverse and complicated. And that distinguished American museums because it made them the property of the community, a resource for the community, in service to the community, and run by the community. And if we look at the success of the American model compared to any other model in the world, I think it derives fundamentally from that connection to the community. They don't exist outside of it. European museums are great places. They're extraordinarily interesting. They have very rich and deep collections that were built over, in some cases, more than 1,000 years. Most of them are owned and run by the government primarily, and they are provided as a resource to the world, but they are not owned and operated in the same way that American institutions are. So if we reflect for a moment then on the American experiment, and we recognize that we're all here in this room, physically or just virtually, to celebrate and invest our time and effort and resources in the well-being of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, why is that? What is it about this experiment that makes it so successful? Why do these museums matter to us? This book project that Tony mentioned, that I have just finished, was really an exploration of what it is about museums that is of such enduring importance in America. And I identified 4 large ideas that are at the center of what makes, I think, the American Museum so successful. None of these are revelations to you. I am not, in my remarks today, going to share with you some great discovery that you didn't think of. But the idea is to talk about them collectively. And it allows us in some ways to reaffirm our commitment to museums and why they're so important. Perhaps especially at a time when, even though here we are in New Bedford celebrating the museum, I think we can also recognize that our society today is riven in fundamental ways. We are a polarized society. There are all kinds of questions being asked of museums too. What are they for? Who do they serve? Do they meet their mission? Are they really meeting the obligations they were intended to meet? I certainly hear those questions regularly here in New York at the Metropolitan. I believe the answer is yes, we're doing a great job, but we do have an obligation to answer those questions. So as I step back from all of that heat of the moment and those particular discussions, I think there are 4 larger themes that are at the center of why museums matter, including the New Bedford Whaling Museum. The first is maybe the most obvious. Museums are places of consequence. These are physical entities. They are sometimes and very often they're monuments. They're architectural entities of beauty and importance in the community that offer us stability, permanence. These are places that we can visit whenever we want to. And for many of us, including I suspect many of you in the room, have visited this museum throughout most of your lives. You have had an ongoing relationship with the New Bedford Museum in ways that is very meaningful to you. Even though museums tend to change their collections and their exhibits and their spaces, they don't do so rapidly that we feel like we don't know these places. That whenever we go back to these museums that we love, we know that we're going back to visit an old friend, to see objects in the collection that are important to us, that have a history that resonates with us. And we're inside spaces that feel safe, that I think is a very important idea that Matthew mentioned as well, that these are safe spaces. They're important to us because we know we can always go to them and they're there for us. So they're complex architected spaces that resonate with us and that endure with us throughout our lives. In all of those ways, it's very important. And in that sense, they're much like the Metropolitan Museum and the New Bedford Museum and the Louvre and the Parthenon. We all have that in common. So that in some ways is the most obvious reason that museums matter, because they're places that matter. But I think more important than that, they're places for learning and inspiration. It's what goes on inside the buildings that is of such great importance. And here too, I think Matthew mentioned this theme, and it's a very important one. Museums are places where ideas need to live. Good ideas, controversial ideas. Museums are places where we really can create a forum for the discussion of whatever it is that's on our minds related to the mission of the institution. If we think about the museum as a forum for ideas, there aren't many places in our world today, in our society, that really function like a forum for ideas, the way a museum does. Imagine for a moment as an experiment, just thinking about what would New Bedford be like if the Whaling Museum wasn't there at all. It just didn't exist. Or even going further, there were no museums. None of them existed. Where would we go to come together to discuss issues, to learn from each other, to reflect on the events of the day and the way they affect our own sense of ourselves, our history, our future, our destiny? Those things matter to a society that is founded on principles and ideals as the American society is. If we don't have places like that for us to find the time and the space to do that, we cannot flourish as a civilization. So I think in a fundamental way, the museum plays a role in a free society that allows ideas to live. And indeed, in my book, I spend a fair amount of time talking about my concern that we live in a society that's increasingly incapable of difficult discussion. We certainly see in our Congress that they're not so good at that. And if we can't find places and ways and guidelines that allow us to learn from each other, to connect us to ideas that make us uncomfortable, which is often where, when you're uncomfortable, it's where learning is most likely to take place. If all you ever do is hear stuff you already know, you're not learning very much. Museums need to be places that confront us with ideas that are new and different, that allow us, within that safe context, to discuss and explore, and ideally to grow as individuals. And if we can't do that, we can't flourish as a society. So I think museums serve a fundamental function as a forum for ideas, and we should not shy away from creating exhibits and programs that invite us to challenge assumptions, to look at difficult issues, but to do it in a place where the ground rules are clear that it's okay to have these discussions here. We're here to learn from each other. The third reason that museums matter is that they are places for the community. I am often asked, and it's possible Amanda is too, who actually owns your museum? I don't understand, like, who owns them at? The technical answer is that it is held in trust by the trustees who oversee the well-being of the institution. But the answer that I would give is the museum is owned by all of us. We are held in trust to the public. We, all of our institutions, New Bedford, the Met, we were founded by our citizens. In New Bedford, it was 100 citizens who came together to create this museum. And it was founded with the idea that we will all own it. We will work together to develop a vision for this institution in service to our community. And over the course of more than a century at New Bedford, you have increasingly perfected the realization of that mission by serving more and more different constituencies within the larger community. I know at the Metropolitan, the founding mission in 1870 was to create a museum in service to everyone. But in fact, we didn't do that so very well. We didn't even have a sign outside the museum that told people what it was. So that early in my tenure as president, I remember sitting at the information desk. This was 7 years ago. And someone came into the museum and just said to me, "Can you tell me where I am? I don't know where I am." And so it's important to remind ourselves that people come to us from very different places, and being accessible. And if we are in service to the community, we need to be accessible to the wider community, is an ongoing effort. So the third goal, or the third reason museums matter, is because they are places for the community. We are founded by our citizens, we are funded by them. So then the question is, who pays for the museum? Whose obligation is it to sustain the New Bedford Museum? How does that work? And I would say the answer is the healthiest institutions that we can create are the ones that are funded by everybody. People with vast resources can make very large gifts. People with more limited resources can make smaller gifts. But the wider range there is of support for the institution through all the different ways we generate revenue, philanthropically, through admissions programs, through our retail shops, through grants from the government and foundations and other sources. The more wide-ranging that source of funding is, the more independence it gives us to do the things that we think are right without being owned by any one entity. And equally important, I think, the more wide-ranging the sources of funding, the more accountable we have to be to the constituencies that we're serving. If we are generating resources from everyone, then we are in fact owned by everyone, and we need to make sure we're delivering value to everyone. So I think being a community resource requires community funding. And equally, leading the institution is ultimately a function of what I would call shared governance. There's a president or a director in most museums. There's a board of trustees. There are other constituencies as well that have a vested interest in what the institution does. Shared governance is the only way for mission-driven institutions to function effectively and be responsive to the communities they serve. And that means that all of those entities, the president and her staff, the board of trustees, the local community, the membership, the city government, all of them have an obligation to participate appropriately in the well-being of the institution. And when they do, that's when the museum thrives. That's when the good things happen. So being a community resource is one of the ways in which we are distinguished in the world from other museums, and it is our greatest source of strength. Then finally, the fourth reason museums matter is because we all look for them, inside them, some connection to our own identity. And this is increasingly an interesting issue. That I'll give you an example of the Metropolitan. We're an art museum. When the Met opened in 1870, it aspired to be what they called an encyclopedic museum. We're going to have the art of the entire world here. But in fact, mostly the Met had the art of Europe and a little bit of the art of America. The arts of Africa and the ancient Americas, those were at other kinds of museums, history museums, but not art museums. Asia, we didn't know that much about. But we called ourselves an encyclopedic museum because there was the presumption back in that time that this is the only art that really people need to see. We have clearly evolved as cultural institutions at the Met and in New Bedford and everywhere else, that the collections that we house must reflect the communities that we serve. Because at some level, most people, when they come to the museum, to be sure, they come to be informed, they come to learn about the collections, they want to learn things that are new, but they're also looking in some way, in some fashion, for some reflection of who they are. How do I find myself in this museum? It doesn't have to be a direct link, but they're looking for ways that can connect with their own sense of identity. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that museums are individually places where people come to find themselves, as it were, but also collectively, museums represent our identity as communities. We're very proud of the museums that we have built in our communities. In New Bedford, the New Bedford Whaling Museum is a source of great pride to the community. That's one reason why you're in the room today, because you're proud of this institution and what it represents and what it says about your values as a community, who you are, that you value education, access, diversity, community, the opportunity to learn about the wider world, to celebrate our own history, to share with our families, our friends, and the wider world who we are. We want to tell our story in ways that resonates both now and in the future. So those four large ideas, I think, are what have given purpose and meaning to museums in America over the last 150 years. Places of consequence, a forum for ideas, a center for community, and a place to find identity. And if one reflects on our history, I think it is all of those things that we need to continue to balance as we look to the future. So as we think about the future and what that means today, my sense is very clearly that you guys are in a very strong place, that this is a wonderful moment for New Bedford, that in fact you have a great history, but it sounds to me, based on what I've seen and what I've read, that your future will be even brighter. And there is no question that museums will be more important in the future than they have been in the past, because our society is increasingly challenged in ways that museums are almost uniquely well positioned to serve. If we can't figure out how to discuss difficult issues in the wider world, we need to figure out how to do it in museums and model that in other parts of our society. So there are all kinds of ways in which museums will be more important in the future. And as I think about that, I'll conclude my remarks by saying that what matters the most is being close to your values and understanding your mission. I think you guys do that really well. You have a very clear sense of your mission, and it has evolved from being a historical society to being an institution that serves a much larger mission. Making sure, therefore, as you move forward, that you're thinking about how do you provide access to increasingly large audiences who can find something meaningful to them when they come. That means being relevant. But being relevant does not mean pandering to the public to provide them with the lowest level entertainment to increase the count at the gate. That isn't something you're doing. It isn't something you're contemplating. But there is a risk in our increasingly consumerist society that and I feel those pressures at the Met. Why don't we do this? And why don't we do that? And it would be great. We'd get more people to come in. Because we're an art museum dedicated to education and learning and not simply entertainment. So being relevant is meeting people where they are, helping to bring them into your community, but not debasing the mission along the way so that people aren't given the opportunity to learn and to grow. Another concern as you look to the future is being sustainable. Museums are built to last. This came up earlier in the meeting, that our institutions, I think as Amanda mentioned, are intended to last forever. That means we need to steward our resources so that we pass on the museum to future generations at least as strong, if not stronger than they are now. We can't make decisions that are good for next year that are also not good in 10 years or 20 years. So our planning has to take the long view. We have to be thoughtful about our place in history. We are simply stewards of our collection and stewards of a mission that is continuing to evolve. That's a humbling kind of concept, but one to keep in mind as we make decisions about the kind of investments we're going to make in the near term and the longer term. And then finally, I think as we look to the future, it's important to remember that ultimately we will do our best by connecting to others within our community and within the wider world, because our collections connect to other collections, our stories and our programs connect to the wider world in all kinds of complicated ways. Perhaps increasingly through virtual technologies. Here I am speaking to you from my apartment in Manhattan. And in all of those ways to think about how we connect what we do to the wider world. If we can take our values and our mission and translate that into something that resonates with the larger world, and do that at New Bedford, and do that at the Metropolitan, and do that at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and everywhere else, the Smithsonian, we create a network that allows our values as a free society dedicated to individual rights, to learning, to freedoms that we hold dear. Museums can advance that democratic mission by fulfilling their own mission each day along the way. And I am sure that for New Bedford, better days are ahead. And I'm delighted to have had a chance to speak with you today. Thank you. And I know we're not going to do questions, so I will turn it off, go to mute. Thank you so much.
Daniel, you have given us so much to think about and to talk about. And to the extent that it is a part of what we have been doing for the last few years, the theme that Amanda mentioned of Museum for All is so much a part of what you presented and talked about in your comments. I'm anxious that we can continue the work that we have started, that we can use your book as a guiding light to help us continue the work that we've been doing. And I am very pleased and very honored to have been elected to continue that mission with an incredible staff, with an incredible group of volunteers, and a great board of trustees who have supported this museum with their generosity and their passion and their commitment. Thank you all. And thank you, Daniel. We look forward to welcoming you to New Bedford one of these days in person, sometime soon. Please come and visit us. We would love to have you here and continue this conversation.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank all of our members for joining today and for sustaining the museum through truly unprecedented times and into a bright future. As we enjoy a return to some kind of relative normalcy, I want to thank each and every one of you for making the museum's work possible. There is so much to look forward to. It's right next door. The Ribello exhibit is in the Waddles Gallery. Exhibits featuring local artists, Henry Hornstein and Bill Shattuck, will open in early June. On our First Fridays program will commence in June and be available in June, July, and August. And we'll all be coming together to celebrate at our summer benefit on July 16th. We also have a major 19th century landscape exhibition coming this fall. With that, I am pleased to conclude the 119th annual members meeting of the Old Dartmouth Historic Society. Do I have a motion to adjourn? And a second? All those in favor? Oh, all those opposed? There being none, the motion carries. But now I hope that all of you will join us in the Jacobs Family Gallery for a reception with our guest, Matthew Fisher, and with the trustees and all of our members joining us for a little celebration for the day. Thank you all very much.